Your brain is currently stuffed full of historical garbage. You think Columbus was a genius, Vikings wore horns, and Napoleon was short. It is all absolute nonsense manufactured by bored monks, greedy ad agencies, and terrible movie directors. Let's aggressively clear out the junk. Here are 50 massive lies in history that are actually complete BS. Let's get straight to the facts. 1. Spain gets the absolute worst rap in history for the Inquisition, but they were hardly the only ones firing up the stakes. Tossing heretics into the flames was practically a continent-wide European pastime. France and Italy were just as busy running their own religious torture franchises. The Spanish simply suffered from terrible public relations. English Protestant propagandists worked overtime to paint Spain as the ultimate evil empire of the era. So while the British were equally enthusiastic about burning people alive, they just had vastly superior spin doctors to keep their own hands looking relatively clean in the history books. 2. Believing that medieval peasants essentially expired of old age at 30 requires a complete misunderstanding of how averages work. The overall life expectancy was only catastrophically low because infant mortality rates were absolutely brutal. The medieval world was a terrible place to be a toddler. However, if you somehow managed to survive your childhood without catching the plague or drinking contaminated swamp water, you had a completely solid chance of reaching your 60s or 70s. They were not mysteriously dropping like flies the second they hit their mid-20s, they just had a horrifically difficult time getting out of the cradle. 3. Decades of dramatic movies have entirely smeared Captain Bligh from the infamous Mutiny on the Bounty as a whip-cracking psychopath. In reality, the man was a highly respected naval hero. After his ungrateful crew unceremoniously dumped him in a tiny lifeboat, he managed to navigate almost 4,000 miles across the open ocean to safety. And that grand mutiny? It had absolutely nothing to do with brutal working conditions or tyrannical abuse. His sailors simply missed the wild, island-style partying and local women back in Tahiti. History's most famous naval rebellion was essentially just a tropical frat party refusing to end. 4. Thomas Edison did not magically summon the light bulb out of thin air while sitting alone in a dark room. He was essentially the 19th century's most successful corporate shark. Instead of inventing the bulb from absolute scratch, Edison simply took existing functional designs and bought out the patents from the severely underfunded guys who actually did the heavy lifting first. He possessed decent engineering skills, but his true genius was aggressive business strategy and a total lack of shame. Edison was not a lone mystical inventor. He was just the guy with enough money to slap his name on everybody else's homework. 5. Calling Vlad the Impaler. A blood-sucking monster might work perfectly for selling Halloween costumes, but it will absolutely offend anyone living in Romania. Over there, the man is celebrated as a hardcore national hero who aggressively defended his territory against a massive Ottoman invasion. The entire Dracula vampire myth was born from a vicious political smear campaign created by his bitter rivals to completely ruin his reputation across Europe. Centuries later, a writer named Bram Stoker stumbled onto those ancient rumors, threw a spooky cape over the guy, and accidentally launched the most profitable Gothic fiction franchise in history. 6. The dramatic tale of Adolf Hitler throwing a massive tantrum and storming out of the 1936 Olympics to avoid shaking hands with Jesse Owens is completely fabricated. Hitler actually waved at the American track star from his fancy luxury box, and Owens politely waved right back. The truly infuriating plot twist of this story involves the actual American president. Franklin D. Roosevelt is the one who completely snubbed Owens, refusing to invite the national hero to the White House. It was an election year, and Roosevelt was absolutely terrified of losing valuable votes from angry Southern politicians. 7. Print newspapers absolutely manipulated the American public into believing that the War of the Worlds radio broadcast sparked a nationwide panic. There were no terrified mobs rioting in the streets, and definitely zero alien-induced suicides. Print journalists completely fabricated the mass hysteria because radio was a shiny new technology that was aggressively stealing their precious advertising revenue. They desperately needed to make listening to the radio look like a highly dangerous, irresponsible activity. So, if you believe millions of people lost their minds over a fake Martian invasion, You essentially fell for a corporate smear campaign from 1938. 8. Anyone claiming Christopher Columbus bravely sailed into the unknown to prove the Earth was round is completely ignoring basic history. Literally every educated human being since the ancient Greek era already fully understood the planet was a giant sphere. Columbus just happened to be catastrophically terrible at mathematics. He stubbornly calculated that the massive ocean was significantly smaller than it actually is. If a gigantic, uncharted continent had not magically been blocking his path, his entire crew would have slowly starved to death in the middle of absolutely nowhere. He was not a visionary scientist. He was just remarkably lucky. 9. Assuming the spectacular Forbidden City in China was dragged out of the mud by thousands of miserable slaves is entirely inaccurate. That massive imperial palace was actually constructed by over 1 million highly specialized craftsmen and laborers who collected regular wages for their effort. The conditions were absolutely grueling and incredibly dangerous, but it was essentially a massive government infrastructure project rather than a massive forced labor camp. Modern society has a really bad habit of completely confusing standard ancient dynasty economics with the darkest days of pyramid building. Those workers were cashing literal paychecks, not rattling heavy iron chains. 10. The groovy 1960s absolutely did not invent the concept of women wearing trousers. Way back in the 1800s, women trying to survive in rugged mining towns were already throwing on heavy pants purely out of necessity. Doing backbreaking physical labor while wearing a suffocating corset and a giant skirt was essentially a death sentence on the frontier. Sure, wearing denim was technically illegal and considered highly scandalous back in the fancy East Coast cities. But when you are chopping firewood in freezing mud to survive the brutal winter, ridiculous high society fashion laws simply do not matter. 11. History books have been openly lying to you about Alexander Graham Bell inventing the telephone. An incredibly brilliant Italian immigrant named Antonio Meucci actually built a fully functional prototype several years before Bell ever entered the picture. Meucci's only fatal mistake was being completely broke and unable to afford the measly $10 fee to renew his official patent. Bell simply swooped in with vastly superior corporate funding, significantly faster lawyers, and an absolute lack of professional shame. The guy we constantly praise as a technological genius really just had a massive bank account and incredible legal representation. 12. Despite all the heavy black eyeliner and gold jewelry in those classic Hollywood epics, Queen Cleopatra was not remotely Egyptian. She was actually 100% Greek. Her entire royal bloodline descended directly from one of Alexander the Great's top generals, who basically conquered the region and installed himself as king. In fact, Cleopatra was the very first stuck-up ruler in her entire family dynasty, who even bothered to learn the local Egyptian language. For centuries, her ancestors stubbornly spoke Greek. She was essentially a wealthy European colonizer, casually sitting on the throne of the Nile. 13. The dramatic collapse of the Berlin Wall was not some beautifully orchestrated victory planned by brilliant politicians seeking global freedom. The entire monumental event happened because of a catastrophic administrative screw-up. An incredibly stressed East German official completely misread his own notes during a live press conference and accidentally announced that strict travel bans were lifted immediately. Thousands of absolutely shocked citizens rushed the border gates, and the wildly confused military guards simply threw their hands up and stepped aside. One of the greatest geopolitical moments of the 20th century was essentially caused by a guy needing stronger reading glasses. 14. The spicy tale of Lady Godiva riding a horse completely naked through town to protest her husband's ridiculous local taxes is completely fake. That entire bizarre story was completely fabricated by incredibly bored monks over 200 years after the poor woman had already died. At the absolute most, she might have stubbornly ridden through the streets wearing her basic undergarments, which was still considered hugely scandalous during that deeply religious era. But the glorious full nudity aspect? That was nothing more than a medieval monk's personal fantasy, secretly edited into the official historical record just to make things interesting. 15. Every gladiator movie ever made gets the famous Roman hand gestures completely backwards. When a bloodthirsty emperor gave a dramatic thumbs-down gesture in the Colosseum, He was not ordering an execution. Pointing the thumb towards the dirt actually meant swords down, signaling the victorious fighter to spare the loser's life. If the screaming crowd actually wanted a brutal execution, they thrust their thumbs aggressively upwards, perfectly mimicking a sharp sword slicing straight into a jugular vein. Hollywood directors deliberately completely flipped the historic signals because they assumed modern audiences were way too uneducated to understand the reality. 16. George Washington never politely knocked on Betsy Ross's door and asked her to stitch together the very first American flag. There is absolutely zero hard evidence from the Revolutionary War era remotely linking her to the original design. That incredibly patriotic story miraculously appeared nearly a full century later, conveniently told by her own grandson, who was desperately trying to promote his personal business. While she was certainly a professional seamstress who made military flags, framing her as the solo visionary creator of the nation's ultimate symbol is nothing more than an incredibly successful piece of 19th century family marketing. 17. The romanticized idea of the wild California gold rush, creating thousands of instant millionaires, is a complete financial delusion. The brutal reality is that the vast majority of desperate prospectors who traveled out west either went completely broke or died of terrible diseases in the freezing mud. The absolute only people who actually made a massive fortune were the clever local merchants aggressively selling basic shovels, tough denim pants, and ridiculously overpriced breakfast eggs to the starving miners. The entire golden era was not a glorious treasure hunt. It was simply a massive transfer of wealth directly to savvy store owners. 18. It requires a truly special kind of colonial arrogance to claim you discovered an entire continent where indigenous people have already been happily living for roughly 65,000 years. Even if we completely ignore the massive native population, Captain James Cook still was not the very first European tourist to show up. Dutch explorers had successfully landed in Australia, walked around, and mapped huge sections of the coastline a full century before Cook's English ship ever appeared on the horizon. He was literally just the first heavily armed guy obnoxious enough to aggressively claim the massive dirt pile for England. 19. Any tough, heavily bearded Viking warrior wearing a metal helmet with massive animal horns sticking out of it is literally just wearing a costume from a 19th century theatrical opera. Real Norse raiders would never dream of wearing something so phenomenally stupid into violent combat. Having giant, rigid handlebars permanently attached to your skull during a chaotic, muddy sword fight is practically suicidal. The absolute only thing those massive horns would be good for is giving your enemy the perfect, convenient leverage to violently snap your neck in half. Opera designers really did ancient military tactics dirty with that ridiculous aesthetic. 20. Pop culture absolutely loves to depict medieval peasants as permanently caked in thick mud and smelling worse than an open sewer. The reality is quite the opposite. Massive public bathhouses were incredibly popular and used constantly by regular city dwellers who actually enjoyed being clean. The true tragedy is figuring out why they suddenly stopped washing altogether. Much later on, highly educated medical professionals started spreading the wildly stupid rumor that sitting in hot water would open your pores and invite the bubonic plague inside. Yes, fancy doctors literally prescribed being absolutely filthy as a bulletproof medical strategy to survive. 21. Parents desperately need to stop telling their kids that Albert Einstein failed high school math just to make them feel slightly better about terrible report cards. It is an absolute, undeniable fabrication. The man had completely mastered incredibly complex differential calculus by the time he was only 15 years old. When a ridiculous newspaper article actually published the false rumor that he had failed basic arithmetic, Einstein publicly laughed and quickly pointed out he was always at the absolute top of his class. He was a certified, undeniable genius from day one, not some slow late bloomer who suddenly figured out physics. 22. The charming elementary school myth that America's very first president wore a pair of rustic wooden teeth is completely adorable and aggressively false. George Washington's actual dentures were a horrifying, Frankenstein-level nightmare. They were brutally constructed from a grotesque mixture of carved ivory, heavy lead, gold wire, and actual human teeth that were forcefully purchased and pulled straight from the mouths of his own enslaved workers. So the next time you admire his stoic face on the crumpled $1 bill, remember he is not hiding simple timber in there. He is actively hiding an absolute torture chamber of a mouth. 23. History books absolutely love a clean, easily digestible narrative, which is exactly why they pretend Rosa Parks was the very first black woman to completely refuse to give up her bus seat. In reality, a remarkably brave 15-year-old girl named Claudette Colvin did the exact same thing 9 entire months earlier in the very same city. However, local civil rights leaders strongly felt that an unwed pregnant teenager simply was not the respectable face they desperately needed for a massive national boycott. So, they quietly buried her incredible defiance and specifically waited for someone with a much safer public image. 24. Benjamin Franklin absolutely did not spend his entire diplomatic mission in France treating the entire country like his own personal dating app. The actual truth is significantly more boring. While Franklin was undeniably a massive flirt who truly loved being surrounded by intelligent female company, there is zero historical proof of the raging sexual escapades everybody claims he enjoyed. He was actually a heavily overweight, severely elderly man suffering from crippling gout, who just really enjoyed casually charming wealthy ladies at fancy Parisian dinner parties. He was a brilliant political negotiator, not some completely unstoppable colonial gigolo breaking hearts across Europe. 25. It is a massive historical injustice that Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin permanently gets blamed for inventing the most infamous decapitation machine in human history. The actual bloody device was engineered by a completely different man, a French surgeon named Antoine Louis. Dr. Guillotin merely stood up in a political meeting and gently suggested that if they simply must execute people, maybe they should use a precise machine instead of a wildly drunk executioner swinging a heavy, completely dull axe. For that entirely logical suggestion, his family name was forever permanently attached to a violent contraption that he personally deeply despised. 26. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 violently wiped out a massive chunk of the city, and for over a full century, society confidently blamed a clumsy farm animal. The famous legend claims Mrs. O'Leary's cow aggressively kicked over a glass lantern in a wooden barn, immediately sparking the massive inferno. That entire story is pure, unadulterated fiction. The lazy journalist who wrote the original newspaper article eventually admitted he completely fabricated the whole thing just because he thought it sounded like a fun, colorful detail. An entirely innocent bovine was literally framed for a horrific urban disaster just to boost sales. 27. Did you really think an incredibly hardened, heavily armed Spanish conquistador was wandering blindly through the miserable, mosquito-infested swamps of Florida, desperately looking for magical anti-aging water? Ponce de Leon never gave a single thought to the completely mythical Fountain of Youth. His actual ruthless mission was finding huge piles of gold and securing prime coastal real estate to build a highly profitable new colony. The ridiculous fairy tale about the magical glowing spring was entirely invented by his bitter political rivals years after his death, just to make him look like a gullible, utterly senile old fool chasing muddy puddles. 28. I absolutely hate to ruin all those highly magical movies featuring handsome men pulling glowing swords out of massive stones, but King Arthur is almost certainly a complete phantom. There is exactly zero credible historical record of any king named Arthur actually ruling Britain during the brutally violent 5th century. Most modern historians heavily agree. He is essentially a fictional medieval superhero. Writers simply took the incredibly bloody, completely unglamorous real-life stories of about 5 different local warlords and violently mashed them together into one noble, completely imaginary guy. Camelot was never real. It was basically just a medieval comic book. 29. Pop culture has completely twisted Joan of Arc into an absolutely unstoppable medieval killing machine, violently slashing her way through terrified English soldiers. The historical reality is significantly different. She never actually fought in a single muddy battle, and she definitely never killed a single person. She functioned far more as a brilliant strategic advisor and an incredibly inspiring military mascot who carried a massive shiny banner right into the danger zone to massively boost troop morale. Taking an arrow to the shoulder while completely unarmed requires insane bravery, but she simply was not out there chopping off heads like an action star. 30. An incredibly shocking number of people truly believe Abraham Lincoln sat down at his desk, signed the Emancipation Proclamation, and instantly wiped out slavery across the entire American continent. That is fundamentally legally incorrect. The presidential order strictly applied only to those specific southern states currently engaged in active, violent rebellion against the Union Army. Disgustingly, human slavery remained completely legal and heavily protected in loyal border states like Kentucky and Delaware for years until the 13th Amendment finally dropped the constitutional hammer. Lincoln's famous document was not a magical wand of instant human rights. It was a highly calculated military strategy. 31. The self-righteous politicians who passed Prohibition genuinely believed making alcohol completely illegal would instantly turn America into a perfectly sober, polite utopia. What an absolute catastrophic joke. While drinking technically dipped for about 5 minutes, it quickly violently surged back. Only this time, absolutely everyone was guzzling terrifyingly strong, completely unregulated bathtub moonshine. To enforce this absolute nonsense, the federal government actually aggressively ordered industrial alcohols to be heavily poisoned, resulting in thousands of agonizing civilian deaths. The government completely failed to stop people from partying, accidentally birthed the modern organized mafia, and deliberately poisoned its own citizens. 32. There is a wildly popular, highly patriotic myth that the president's massive mansion was heavily painted bright white just to hide enormous, embarrassing scorch marks after the British famously burned it down. It definitely sounds like a great story of American defiance, but it is total garbage. The entire building was actually slathered in a thick, protective white wash lime mixture several years before the war even started. They simply did it to completely protect the incredibly porous Scottish stone from violently cracking during freezing winter weather. When the British did torch the place, they just applied a fresh, much-needed coat. 33. You have definitely heard the wildly famous phrase about Emperor Nero casually playing the fiddle while Rome violently burned to the ground. Let's immediately start with the most obvious historical problem here. The violin would not even be invented for another entire 1,000 years. Beyond that glaring impossibility, Nero was not even anywhere near the city limits when the catastrophic blaze actually started. He supposedly rushed frantically back to the capital and spent his own massive personal fortune organizing an emergency fire brigade. His terrible reputation exists purely because history is exclusively written by the victorious, and his bitter political enemies hated him. 34. If Paul Revere had actually aggressively ridden his horse wildly through the pitch-dark streets screaming that the British were coming at the absolute top of his lungs, he would have been arrested in 5 minutes. Why? Because almost everybody living in Massachusetts at that exact moment still proudly considered themselves highly loyal British citizens. Yelling that would just confuse absolutely everyone. He was operating on a highly classified, totally secret midnight espionage mission. He was quietly sneaking up to specific houses and urgently whispering that the regulars were coming out to avoid violently alerting the heavily armed Royal Military Patrols. 35. Do not trust a single ridiculous thing Hollywood shows you about ancient Roman gladiators aggressively fighting to the brutal, bloody death every single afternoon. That would have been an absolutely catastrophic business model. Gladiators were incredibly expensive, highly trained corporate investments, extremely similar to modern professional prize fighters. Most of their highly dramatic matches actually featured strict rules, professional referees, and usually ended with both exhausted guys walking away completely alive to fight another profitable day. If you are a wealthy Roman promoter, permanently slaughtering your absolute highest-earning star athlete on a random Tuesday is a terrible way to run a franchise. 36. We aggressively celebrate the 4th of July with extremely loud fireworks and massive outdoor barbecues, completely assuming all the Founding Fathers proudly stood in a noble circle that exact day to bravely sign the Declaration of Independence. Prepare to be immensely disappointed. Almost absolutely nobody actually signed the physical document on the 4th. The vast majority of those wealthy guys did not even put pen to paper until an entire month later in early August. and a few lazy stragglers dragged it out until the freezing winter. The famous summer holiday literally only actually celebrates the day they finally approved the rough draft. 37. Offering a massively overpriced, deeply clear diamond ring to propose marriage is absolutely not some beautiful, ancient, deeply romantic human tradition. You are being completely emotionally manipulated by corporate greed. The De Beers mining cartel literally invented the entire expensive concept out of thin air in the 1930s, using a wildly aggressive advertising campaign just to successfully offload their massive surplus of shiny rocks. Before that brilliant, highly manipulative scam, regular people proposed with basic rubies, cheap sapphires, or sometimes just a practical metal sewing thimble. If you are currently saving up 3 agonizing months of your salary, an ad agency totally owns you. 38. Walk through literally any incredibly fancy museum, and you will see countless ancient Roman and Greek statues heavily carved from stunning pure white marble. We treat them as the absolute undeniable pinnacle of classy, beautifully understated elegance. The actual Romans would think we are totally insane. Originally, every single one of those highly revered statues was aggressively painted in the most glaring, tacky, incredibly bright neon colors imaginable. They looked vastly less like high-end sophisticated art and vastly more like giant, cheap plastic action figures. The intense paint just naturally faded away over thousands of years, accidentally leaving behind a completely blank aesthetic. 39. James Cameron makes highly entertaining, visually stunning movies, but you cannot trust a single frame of his work for actual historical accuracy. The horrific sinking of the Titanic had absolutely nothing to do with a glory-hungry captain demanding maximum ocean speed to break a transatlantic record. That is pure fabricated Hollywood melodrama. In reality, the doomed ship did not even have all of its heavy industrial boilers lit, and the seasoned captain was just following a standard, boring corporate schedule. It was simply a highly cautious voyage that unfortunately crossed paths with a massive chunk of ice in the dark. 40. You can immediately stop blaming the incredible, blinding arrogance of the Titanic's wealthy owners for wildly claiming the massive luxury vessel was entirely unsinkable. They absolutely never printed that word on a single official marketing poster. That remarkably hubristic, legendary phrase was actually exclusively coined by dramatic newspaper reporters only after the massive ship had already tragically gone straight to the bottom of the icy ocean. The greedy press just desperately wanted to make the massive loss of human life feel ironically poetic to sell more morning papers. The shipping company only ever cautiously claimed their new expensive boats were practically unsinkable. 41. We practically view Mahatma Gandhi as an impossibly perfect, permanently glowing historical saint who floated through life completely incapable of doing any wrong. Well, his aggressively hidden early years are going to deeply shock you. When he was working as a highly educated young lawyer in South Africa, he actually wrote some aggressively racist letters, loudly complaining about the native black population. And he completely actively supported the incredibly brutal military wars waged by the British Empire. His legendary world-changing philosophy of radical nonviolence and absolute human equality was something that slowly and incredibly painfully evolved over several decades of serious mistakes. 42. If an actual ancient Japanese ninja ever stupidly tried to violently sneak around a busy enemy town wearing a skin-tight, pitch-black bodysuit with a cool face mask, he would have been arrested in exactly 5 seconds. That is quite literally the absolute worst imaginable outfit for a highly trained secret spy aggressively trying not to look suspicious. Real, deeply professional ninjas survived by dressing up in totally boring, incredibly everyday clothes like poor filthy farmers, wandering religious monks, or basic local merchants so they could completely invisibly vanish into a busy crowd. The famous black pajama costume actually originated from theater stagehands. 43. That fierce, muscle-flexing Rosie the Riveter poster shouting that women can do it is everywhere today, but during World War II, nobody cared. It was never a massive, inspiring national campaign to empower millions of hardworking women. It was literally just a highly localized, internal corporate motivational poster, hung inside one single Westinghouse electric factory out in the Midwest. They only left the totally ignored thing on the factory wall for 2 measly weeks before throwing it in the garbage. It didn't become a famous feminist icon until 40 years later, when someone dug it out of an archive. 44. The French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte has been directly blamed for a massive ton of historical destruction, but you cannot pin the missing nose of the Great Sphinx on his artillery troops. Everyone loves the dramatic story of a stray French cannonball blasting the face entirely off the ancient stone monument, but it is totally fake. Detailed artistic sketches drawn by wealthy European travelers entire decades before Napoleon even set foot in the Egyptian sand clearly show the giant nose was already gone. The real vandal was likely just an angry religious fanatic wandering the desert with a heavy chisel. 45. Mel Gibson's massive cinematic epic Braveheart is phenomenally entertaining, but historically speaking, it is an absolute train wreck of a movie. The most glaring, ridiculous lie is the legendary Scottish rebel William Wallace fiercely charging into a bloody battlefield proudly wearing a traditional tartan kilt. The Scottish kilt was not even actually invented until roughly 3 full centuries after Wallace's severed head was put on a spike. A real 13th century Scottish warrior would have been uncomfortably wrapped in thick iron chainmail and boring long tunics. Gibson fought a massive war proudly wearing a costume from the completely wrong millennium. 46. We absolutely deeply owe a massive historical apology to the ancient Egyptians, because despite what massive dramatic Hollywood religious epics aggressively insist, completely brutalized slaves did absolutely not build the Great Pyramids. The incredibly muscular men heavily hauling those massive stone blocks were actually highly skilled, extremely decently paid union laborers who were treated incredibly well by the massive government. They constantly ate vast amounts of premium roasted beef and heavily drank absolute gallons of thick, incredibly nutritious beer every single day. Totally miserable, heavily chained slaves simply do not get strong labor unions and incredibly prime, highly respected graveyard real estate. 47. You can safely delete the hilarious image of a giant wooden pony completely stuffed full of sweaty, heavily armed Greek soldiers directly from your brain. Modern historians highly suspect the famous Trojan horse was never an actual literal carpentry project conveniently left outside the fortified city gates. The famous story is most likely ancient poetic nonsense. The giant horse was probably just a clever metaphor for a massive, heavy siege-battering ram draped in damp horse hides to prevent it from catching fire. Or it was a devastating earthquake. Nobody was actually hiding inside a giant medieval toy. 48. There is a horrifying, highly persistent rumor that 19th century Egyptian railroad workers frantically shoved thousands of dried-out mummies directly into the blazing hot furnaces of steam trains just to keep them running. Luckily, that is entirely false. It was literally just a sarcastic, dark joke originally written by the famous author Mark Twain, and completely gullible people entirely missed the punchline. However, incredibly wealthy Europeans actually did aggressively buy massive amounts of ancient mummies, crushed the ancient corpses into extremely fine powder, and literally consumed them as magical medicine, which is honestly way more disgusting than using them for firewood. 49. The utterly catastrophic, globally devastating Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 has easily the most unfair name in the entire long history of medical science. It totally did not originate anywhere remotely near the country of Spain. Modern epidemiologists actually trace the terrifying viral outbreak to either a totally random, filthy pig farm in rural Kansas or a terribly crowded, unsanitary military base directly in France. The terrible virus only officially got its highly famous name because Spain was completely neutral during World War I, meaning their newspapers were the only ones legally allowed to report on the massive piles of bodies. 50. It seems like a perfectly logical, unshakable historical fact that the terrifyingly invasive medical procedure known as the C-section was specifically named after Julius Caesar, purely because that is exactly how he was born. Well, ancient history is unfortunately full of massive disappointments. During the violent era of ancient Rome, that extreme surgical procedure was only ever performed on heavily pregnant mothers who were already dead. Since incredibly solid historical records completely prove Caesar's mother was very much alive and active in his adult political career, the famous dictator definitely arrived the highly painful, completely old-fashioned way. All right, let's hear it. Which one of these facts completely ruined your childhood? Or are you still going to stubbornly defend that George Washington had wooden teeth just because your third-grade teacher said so? Argue with me in the comments, I dare you. While you're down there typing out your outrage, hit the like button and subscribe. Don't be a historical peasant.